Welcome back. In this video, we're going to read files and write two files just like before, but instead in an asynchronous way. So let's add some comments here before. So this is the blocking synchronous way, and then we will do an exercise in a non-blocking asynchronous way. So we're not going to do the same thing. We're just going to invent some other kind of crazy exercise here. So to read a file in an asynchronous way, it works like this. Again, we need the fs module and then read file, but this time not read file sync, of course. And again, we pass in the name of the file, or the path to the file actually. And so again, it is at txt, and the file that I want right now is called start.txt. So this one, oops, sorry for that. So this is the file that I want. All the task is read this, and I'm going to explain to you why a bit later. For now, don't worry about the content here. So in the read file, we actually do not have to specify the file encoding, okay? And so the next parameter, the second one, will be a callback function. And that is what we learned in the last lecture. So Node.js is all built around callbacks in order to implement an asynchronous behavior. And this is how it works. So Node will start reading this file here in the background, and as soon as it is ready, it will then start the callback function that we specify here. Okay, and it calls this callback function with two arguments. The first one is the error, and the second one is the actual data. Okay, so this error first callback style is very typical in Node.js. Okay, so many times the first parameter in a callback will be the error in case there was any, and the second one will then be the data itself. What matters here is that the error is usually always the first one. Okay, and so just to test it out for now, let's simply log to the console the data. And so let's now actually test that. But before we do this, let us actually still specify the file encoding here, okay? So I'm not 100% sure that it works without this. So clean this now, run it again, and here we see read this. So let's analyze again what happened here. So as soon as this function here is run, it will start reading this file in the background without blocking the rest of the code execution. Okay, so let me actually demonstrate this here. So a console.log will read file, and just to have a bit less confusion there, let me comment out this part here. Okay, and so what do you think will happen now? What log are we going to see first? And indeed, first we see will read file, and only then we see read this. So again, why did that happen? So as I mentioned, Node.js will start reading the file in the background here and will not block the code, and will then immediately move on to the next line of code. And the next line of code, well, it's this log here. And so that is the first thing that will be logged here to the terminal. Only then, when the file is completely read, this callback function here will run. Okay? And again, this callback function has access to the error and the data that was read. And we could really call this here anything that we wanted. We could call it text as well. It doesn't really matter. All that matters is that it is the second argument in this callback function. Let's actually go back to data, because I like that way better. And so only then this second console.log will run with the data, so with the text that was in the file. And so that's why we see this here as the second log. All right. Now to take it even further, let's actually do another read file, but instead of this, so that I can show you how we can basically do multiple steps one after the other with callbacks. So steps that depend upon the result of the previous step. Okay, so that's why actually in this start file I have read this, because then there is a file called read this, which has the content that we're actually interested in. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is to copy this code and put it in here. I'm going to call this one data1 and then data2. And the result of the second step, so the second file read, will depend on the first one. That's because we will use the data for the file name. Remember? So here we are doing a template string now, because we need to put in that variable, and it is called data1. Okay, makes sense? So data1 will be read this. Okay, and so then in the next step, we read txt slash read this dot txt, which is then this. Okay, so that's why this file name here is the same as this content. And so let's log to the console data2 then. And let's quickly test if this works. And indeed, so that is the content of read this.txt. And now I'm actually going to take it one step further even, because there's some other text in this append file that I want to add to this first string. So this text coming from the other file. And so we have yet another step that depends on the previous step. And so what I'm going to do is to add another read file in here. So just like this. So this one is called append. And I'm going to call this one the data3. Data3 here. And so let's again run that. And okay, so now we have these two results here. All right, and now finally, as the last step, I want to write these two strings together into a file. Okay, so far we have only read files, but I want to write a file as well. So let's do that right here as well. So fs.write file, and of course, we're not using the synchronous one like we did before, but again, we use, just like here and here and here, we use the asynchronous version, not the synchronous one. So txt slash, missing this one here, final, then we should add the text encoding here as well. And then this one also accepts a callback function. But in this case, there is no data that we read, and so we don't need two arguments. So the only argument that we have is the error, actually. Okay, so here we have the error and the data that was read, but here in write file there is no data. All that there is, or can be, is an error. Okay, and actually we're missing something here, which is what we actually want to write to the file. Okay, and so that is the second argument, and what that is data2 and data3. So again, a template string here, data2, then a new line character, which again is \n, and then data3. All right. And so just like with the read file functions, then this callback is what's run at the end. So what I'm going to do here is to simply log to console that the files have been written, or that the file has been written. Your file has been written. And let's just use some fun emoji here just to make the console a bit brighter for us. And I think we should be done like this. So let's clear the console one more time, run it, and indeed we see your file has been written. So has it really? Final? Oh yeah, here it is. So that is the read this text and the append text both together, both in the same file. Okay, so that is how we perform multiple steps in orders using callback functions, right? Because imagine that you simply did the same file read and then the second file read, so this one, right after that. Well, how would you then get access to the data from the first one, right? And so that is how this pattern emerges. It actually has its own name, and I think I mentioned that in the last video. It is the called callback hell, and there are some solutions to make this code here more readable and better to understand. But for now, that doesn't matter at all for you. What matters is that Node.js is built around this philosophy of callbacks. So that is how Node.js implements asynchronous operations by calling callbacks as soon as the operation that it's doing has been finished. And by the way, this way of writing functions that you see here, again, in case you're not familiar with it, it is the new ES6 syntax as well. Okay, so again, I hope that you are familiar with ES6 at this point, and so that all of this makes complete sense to you. If we were to write this function here without the arrow function syntax, we would do simply like this. Function error data1 and then like this. So that is a normal function, let's say an old-fashioned function, and the new version works like this. The difference between them is mainly the syntax, but also the fact that an arrow function, so this kind of function, doesn't get its own this keyword. So it uses the this keyword from the parent function. And that is called the lexical this keyword, while a normal function like this one always gets its own this keyword. Right? I'm sure you're familiar with that kind of stuff, but just doing a small review here in case you're not. Okay, I hope that made sense. We did actually never use this error here. We didn't handle any errors. So for example, imagine that this file here did not exist. Well, we could then use this arrow. And let's actually do that, but just for this one here. So I don't want to create all of these error handlers here. But just in this situation, let's say there was an error. And so let's say if error, then return from this function, so do nothing else, and log to the console, error. And then we can add some other emoji here, like this explosion, so like something exploded here. So let's now change this here, like start.txt, run this again, and so we have this error now. So it gives us this log to the console, and since we did return, it will not do anything after that. So all of this is basically ignored and will not run, which is exactly what we want, right? But if we put it back to normal and then run it again, well, then everything works just like before. So get used to this pattern of callbacks because you will see it all over the place in Node.js and throughout this section.